When I decided to move out on my own, my dad's friend Cindy was subletting her 2-bedroom apartment. She promised me a good deal, but I would have to share the place with an older woman she had found. Since Cindy was having financial struggles, I understood the situation. On the day I moved in, Cindy introduced me to the woman. Her name was Betty, and she was around 60 years old. It felt a bit odd knowing I'd be living with someone old enough to be my grandmother. Since the apartment was already furnished, I only needed to bring my own bed and dresser. Things started getting weird by the second night. I was watching TV in the living room when I noticed Betty peeking her head around the corner from the hallway, staring at me with an eerie intensity. She mumbled a few strange, unintelligible sounds. "Betty, are you okay?" I asked. She didn't reply, just groaned and disappeared down the hall. Immediately, I called Cindy to ask if anything was wrong with Betty. Cindy said she didn't know of anything unusual since she'd only met Betty a week before. When I told her what had happened, Cindy was just as surprised as I was. The next morning, I ran into Betty while she was cooking eggs in the kitchen. She greeted me with a good morning, and I asked her if she was okay after what happened the night before. Betty looked confused, not understanding what I was talking about. When I mentioned how she had stared at me and made strange noises, she insisted she didn't remember any of it. I could only assume she had some kind of mental episode. Skipping the unnecessary details, later that night, I was lying in bed using my laptop with the lights off. Suddenly, there was a knock at my bedroom door. I muted my laptop and could hear Betty's familiar groaning noises, just like the night before. To be honest, I didn't feel comfortable going out there, but this confirmed that something was seriously wrong with her. She kept knocking. It didn't stop. The door wasn't locked, and I thought if something was truly wrong, she would come in. The knocking and groaning must have lasted for about a minute before I finally heard her walk away. It seemed like her strange episodes only happened at night. I almost wished I had a lock on my door because the whole situation was giving me the creeps. But unfortunately, there wasn't one. Thankfully, Betty left, so I could finally get some sleep. I woke up later, thinking it was around 9 a.m., but it was still pitch dark outside. I looked at the clock, and it was only 1:30 a.m. The sound of a creaking floorboard made it clear what had woken me up. There was a figure standing at the end of my bed in the dark. "Betty?" I called out. Again, I heard the same groaning sounds. I quickly turned on the lamp beside my bed, and there she was. The 60-something-year-old woman with long, disheveled gray hair, looking half awake, half crazed. But the thing that terrified me the most was the large knife in her hand. I screamed in horror, curling up in the corner of my bed, expecting her to attack or do something, but she didn't. She just kept making those strange noises, then turned and left the room. I ran to the door, slammed it shut, and barricaded it with my dresser. I tried calling Cindy, but she was likely asleep at that hour. I knew I had to survive the night. It felt like the longest 6 hours of my life before the sun finally rose. At 8 a.m., I called Cindy and explained everything that had happened, telling her she needed to evict Betty immediately. Cindy couldn't believe what I was telling her, but she apologized and promised to come over that day. Cindy arrived to talk to Betty. Unfortunately, she couldn't evict her without prior notice, and the eviction process could take months. So Cindy advised me to move out and find another place while she dealt with the situation. Betty apologized, claiming she had no memory of what happened. After doing some research, Cindy and I realized that Betty likely suffered from severe sundowning syndrome, which causes people to become confused or aggressive as the day comes to an end. It's terrifying to think that, in her confused state, she might have intended to come into my room and stab me for some unknown reason. I'm not sure how many of you have experienced college life, but if you have, you probably remember that first feeling of stepping into your dorm and meeting your roommate, the person who, in theory, would be your companion for the next 4 years. I can definitely remember mine. The first time I walked into my dorm, I met my roommate. He had pale skin, black hair, glasses, and a slightly feminine tone in his voice. There was nothing wrong with that, but from the moment we shook hands, and I got a limp handshake from him, I felt a bit uneasy. For the sake of this story, let's call him John. I left the room to go greet some of the other people on the floor and meet as many as I could. Right away, I found it easier to get along with some of the other guys more than with John. Anyway, that first night was mostly about unpacking and staying in the room, so I tried to chat with John a bit. He wasn't mean or anything, but he just didn't seem to know how to hold a conversation. I'd ask him about himself, and he'd give me short answers or responses that didn't make much sense. The oddest thing was that John went to bed super early, turning off his lamp around 10 p.m., despite the fact that no one had classes the next day. I just put on my headphones and watched some videos on my phone until around midnight before going to sleep. The next morning, a couple of guys from the floor and I went to grab breakfast together. When I got back to the room, I noticed my duffel bag had been moved. I glanced over at John, who was sitting on his bed. I checked my bag to see if anything was missing, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Still, the bag felt lighter than before. I straight up asked John if he had gone through my bag, but he denied it in a defensive tone. There wasn't much I could do. I didn't have a camera to prove it. The next night, I invited John to hang out with me and a few other guys from the floor, but he declined, saying he wanted to get a head start on his work. So I went out, and when I got back, John was fast asleep. It was late, so I just went to bed as well. It had started raining heavily, and there was a storm in the forecast. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of thunder. I was too comfortable and lazy to roll over and look out the window, but even with my eyes closed, I noticed the frequent flashes from the lightning. Oddly enough, it helped me fall back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to find my backpack open and out of place. I didn't accuse John right away this time, but I decided I was going to stay up that night to figure out what he was up to. After a long day of constant rain, night finally came, and I stayed up in bed on my phone, listening to the rain outside. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I rolled over and pretended to sleep. I stayed like that for a long time, and eventually I started noticing the flashes again. There were 3 of them. I turned over to the other side and saw John sitting up in his bed. He quickly lowered his arms when he noticed me turning over. In that moment, it all clicked. Those weren't flashes of lightning. He had been taking pictures of me. I played dumb and asked, "What are you doing?" John stammered and said he couldn't sleep. The next day, I told the guys on the floor about how weird John had been acting, and they advised me to request a room change. I agreed, and later that day, when I returned to my room, John was actually out for once. I couldn't believe it. His laptop was still open on his bed, and my curiosity got the better of me. I checked his desktop, which was cluttered with folders, programs, and images. I started opening random photos on his computer. Most of them were just weird, but then I stumbled upon something disturbing. Pictures of me. As I clicked on one, I realized it was a picture of me sleeping, taken with an iPhone, using the flash. He had been storing photos of me on his computer, including pictures of my duffel bag and the inside of my backpack. I recorded a video of the screen and deleted all the pictures I could find before closing the laptop. I went straight to the dorm office and showed them the video. I immediately requested a new roommate. I'm not sure how the school dealt with John, but they arranged for me to move to a new room in a different part of the dorms the next day. However, on my last night with John, I couldn't sleep at all. I heard the springs of his bed creak as he got up sometime during the night, and then there was silence. Silence until I heard a quiet breath right above my bed. I knew he was standing there, but I was too terrified to turn around. Less than a minute later, I heard the springs of his mattress again, and the rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, I left the room first thing. My new roommate was like a breath of fresh air, a totally normal guy. Even so, it's still creepy to think that John probably still has those pictures of me sleeping on his phone. I don't know what his plan was with those pictures, and I don't understand why he was standing over my bed that last night, or why he went through my stuff. That guy was a real creep, and I'm just glad I got out of there. There was an ad on Zillow for a shared apartment near the chicken farm where I worked. I decided to move in because the location was convenient and the apartment was already furnished. All I had to bring were my clothes and a small dresser, as the spare room already had a bed. The man renting the room to me was an older gentleman, about 70 years old, and his name was Ben. This was a non-contractual arrangement, meaning I paid rent weekly, but essentially, he was still my roommate. Ben was very traditional, and that extended to everything in the house. Coming from a modest background, I considered this a real bargain. One night, after a long day of work, I collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep like a baby. But suddenly, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door opening. Light from the hallway flooded into the room, and standing at the doorway was old Ben, his hand gripping the doorknob. In a deep, raspy voice, he said, "Stay out of the basement." He claimed he knew I had gone down there. I quickly defended myself and assured him I hadn't because, truthfully, I hadn't even been near it. Ben closed the door and I heard him walk down the stairs. I sat there thinking this guy must be unstable or something. The next day, I had a day off work. Ben took his old jalopy down the road, probably heading to the store. Alone in the house, I couldn't take my eyes off the basement door. I knew it was the basement because I had seen Ben go down there before. I decided to open it, just to take a quick peek. The basement was pitch black, though. I would have never gone down there if it hadn't been for Ben's strange warning about staying out of the basement. But since I figured he wouldn't be back anytime soon, I kept going. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the light switch. At first glance, the basement looked pretty normal, but there was a door in the corner. Behind that door was something unimaginable. The door was tough to open because of a rubber seal underneath it, which I guessed was to keep some horrible smell from spreading throughout the rest of the house. Inside the small room, I was greeted by a nightmare. Bloodstains on the concrete floor, black bags piled in the corner long enough to hold bodies or body parts, and the smell of decay. I had to fight the urge to vomit right there. I noticed a camera hanging in the top right corner, aimed at some workbench. I quickly snapped a photo of the room and hurried out of there. I went back upstairs, packed all my clothes into a garbage bag, and then heard the front door slam shut downstairs. Ben was back. I tried to stay calm and greeted him from the upstairs hallway, but he didn't respond. I heard him open the basement door and stomp down the stairs. That was my cue to run. I sprinted to my car, and without looking back, I drove away. I drove about 15 miles to my brother's farm and showed him the picture. He told me I was an idiot for not calling the cops sooner. So, I called 911 and explained everything, telling them to get a search warrant and check the basement before Ben could clear it out. I made it clear I was just a temporary tenant who had stumbled upon this. A few hours later, someone from the sheriff's department came to my brother's farm, asking for my ID and some additional information. I complied with their requests. They gave me the relieving news that Ben had been arrested. He had been trying to clear out the evidence, but he hadn't been fast enough. The deputies didn't go into much detail about what exactly they found in the bags or anything else, but I don't think they were allowed to. They thanked me and left. My brother let me stay at his farm for a few weeks until I was ready to find another apartment and move on. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. When I was 23, I landed a job in New York City, but I lived in Jersey. Commuting between the two places every day wasn't an option, so moving was necessary. The problem was, I didn't have much money at the time. So when I saw an ad on Craigslist for a very cheap room in an apartment in Hell's Kitchen, I jumped at the opportunity. The next day, I went to the city to check out the apartment, and the landlord gave me a quick tour. He seemed a bit socially awkward, but that didn't really bother me. The catch was, I had to share the apartment with someone else. The landlord mentioned that my roommate's name was Bren, and he described him as quiet and reserved, which he considered a good thing. The landlord knocked on Bren's door to see if he wanted to come out and say hello, but there was no response. The landlord guessed that Bren might be taking a nap, so we continued our conversation in the living room, where I expressed my interest in renting the room. I signed the application, and the next day, the landlord called to confirm that I had the room. A week later, I moved in with the help of my dad, who helped me unload all my stuff into the small bedroom. What struck me as odd was that, during the entire time we were unloading, Bren never came out to say hi, even though it was clear he was home. We could hear him moving around in his room. I quickly realized that Bren probably wasn't going to be the friendly type. After everything was unloaded, my dad left, and I was officially on my own. I sat on my bed, opened my laptop, and started watching Netflix. Then I heard Bren's door open and close. This seemed like the perfect chance to go out and say hello. It was the first time he had left his room. But before I could even make it to my bedroom door, the front door to the apartment slammed shut. I stepped out into the living room, and no one was there. I didn't know what Bren's deal was, but it was clear we would have to meet eventually. I went back to my room, ate a bowl of ramen, and went to bed. I woke up later when I heard the front door close again. Then, footsteps followed, the sound of them moving across the creaky wooden floor, coming closer to my door before stopping. I sat up and looked at the crack beneath the door. I could see the outline of feet through the light seeping in from the hallway. Why was he just standing there like some creep? Naturally, I didn't say anything. I just waited for him to walk away. My door wasn't locked, and I was low-key terrified that he might come into my room. But thankfully, he walked away and returned to his room. I heard his door shut. I tried to sleep, but all night I kept hearing thumping sounds coming from Bren's room. I had no idea what he could be doing. I thought about knocking on his door to ask him to keep it down, but since I hadn't even met him yet, I figured I'd just deal with it for now. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, Bren seemed to be out, maybe at work. I wasn't sure. I spent most of that day shopping for groceries and things I needed for the apartment. When I got back, I dropped my bags on the couch and took a break. I made dinner, watched some Netflix, and all the while, Bren still didn't come home. I ran out to the nearby 7-Eleven to get some toothpaste, and when I returned, I noticed Bren's door was slightly open, and the light was on. I thought this might be my chance to introduce myself. I walked up to the door, knocked lightly twice, and pushed it open. What I saw inside shocked me, or maybe it's better to say what I didn't see. The room was completely empty. There was no furniture except for a single chair sitting in the corner, the kind of chair you'd find in a high school classroom. My heart started racing, and I began to tremble. I turned off the light and shut the door. Was Bren someone who was in the process of moving out? I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat on my bed with a pounding headache. I pulled out my phone and decided to call the landlord to find out what the hell was going on. After dialing the number, I put the phone to my ear and suddenly heard a loud ringing sound coming from my closet. It felt like my heart, which was already pounding, dropped to my stomach. The phone rang twice, then went to voicemail. I got up from my bed, ready to open the closet, but then I stopped. I realized that because the phone rang twice, it meant the landlord had his phone with him and had declined the call. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The landlord was likely hiding in my closet, and there never had been a Bren. I bolted into the bathroom, locked the door, and called the cops. The police arrived shortly after and searched the entire apartment with me. Sure enough, we found the landlord hiding under my bed. I tried pressing charges for trespassing and wanted to get out of the lease, but it turned out there wasn't even a lease. The guy wasn't even the actual landlord. He didn't own the apartment. I never found out the full story, like how he even had the keys in the first place. The next day, I had my dad come back to help me move all my stuff out. The following week, I found another apartment. Moving again was such a hassle, but I had a gut feeling from the start that something was off with this so-called landlord, though I never could have predicted how things would play out. When I was 23, I had to move to another state for work. I'm still working for the same company now, but fortunately, I've been able to return to my hometown and work at the local office here. Back then, I needed to find an affordable place to live. So I posted roommate ads on all the websites: Facebook, Craigslist, Twitter, and even my neighborhood subreddit. A guy named Rob reached out to me through Facebook, saying he had a room available in his house. I looked through his pictures to see if he seemed like a normal guy, and he appeared fine. I didn't mind having a male roommate, as long as he seemed normal, though my parents were very against the idea. Rob and I FaceTimed, during which he gave me a virtual tour of his house. Apparently, he owned the place outright. It was a modest house located in the middle of town, just about a 10-minute drive from where my office would be. He seemed friendly enough, and I didn't get any bad vibes from him. His price was fair, and his house rules were pretty reasonable too. He mentioned that the room was available for immediate move-in, which was perfect for me. So everything was set. A week later, I packed up all my things and drove down. I met Rob right outside the house, and he greeted me, handing over a tea. The first thing I noticed about him was how short he was, standing eye level with me. He helped me bring in some of the heavier bags. Rob showed me to my room, which was already furnished. He mentioned that a friend of his had been living there, but had just moved out recently. Of course, I replaced all the pillows and sheets with my own. The rest of that day, I spent settling in. Rob seemed like he was trying to get to know me, probably wanting me to feel comfortable living there. I didn't get any overly friendly vibes from him. The next day was Sunday, and Rob offered to drive me around town to show me the good shopping centers and restaurants. I wasn't particularly excited about it, but I said yes to get off to a good start with him. He drove me around town, pointing out various places to shop and eat. Then he suggested we grab lunch. I wasn't hungry, and he suggested a sit-down lunch, which felt a little too much like a date to me. I didn't want him to get the wrong idea. I was only here for a room, so I politely declined, saying I wasn't hungry. He immediately suggested we go grab drinks instead. Again, I politely turned him down, explaining that I don't drink on work nights. He got a bit pushy, saying, "Come on, just a couple of drinks." But I stuck to my polite refusal. Eventually, he gave up and suddenly went very quiet, like he was upset. I admit, I started feeling slightly uncomfortable at that point, but nothing I couldn't handle. That week was my first week at work, so I focused mainly on adjusting to my new job. It wasn't until a few days in that I came home to do laundry and noticed that my hamper of clothes looked disturbed, like the clothes weren't how I'd left them. While loading the washing machine, I realized that a pair of my underwear was missing. I searched my room from top to bottom, but they were gone. A disturbing thought crossed my mind. Could Rob have? No, I didn't want to believe that yet, and there was no way I was going to confront him about it. Still, I started wishing my bedroom door had a lock. That weekend, I went to Ace Hardware and bought a lockable doorknob. While Rob wasn't home, I swapped out the old knob with the new one. Now, I could leave the house in peace. I figured I'd tell Rob about it the next time I saw him. But that night, he didn't come home. His schedule seemed random like that. Later that night, I woke up to banging on my bedroom door. It was Rob calling my name, and he didn't sound happy. I checked the time. It was 1:30 in the morning. I decided to pretend I was asleep. Honestly, I was kind of scared to open the door. I had a feeling this was about the doorknob, and I was right. The next morning, I woke up to several texts from Rob saying we needed to talk and that I should come home after work. I replied, "Is this about the doorknob?" And he answered, "Yes." I apologized, saying I had planned to tell him. He texted back, "It has to come off today." His tone was giving me some really bad and weird vibes. I thought out my next response carefully, explaining that as a girl, I felt safer being able to lock my room. This time Rob's tone softened a little, but he still said no, insisting that the old doorknob needed to go back on. I was confused and upset, but I respected his rules. After all, I had installed it without asking. So, I understood why he might be mad. But how did he even know I changed the doorknob? It's not like I left the old one lying around. The idea that he had tried entering my room that night scared me. The next day, I swapped the doorknob back and returned the new one to Ace. That's when things started going downhill. One day, when Rob wasn't home, a girl about my age knocked on the door. She asked if I was living there with Rob, and when I said yes, she immediately warned me to get out. She explained that Rob had multiple restraining orders against him from different women, and he was known to be a dangerous stalker. I was completely speechless. I asked how she knew I was living there. She said she knew he was renting out a room and wasn't surprised he had opted for a female roommate. She told me she'd seen me moving in and had waited until Rob wasn't home to come warn me. I thanked her so much, but I was terrified. I had already paid Rob for the entire month, and I didn't know what to do. The girl offered to help in any way she could. I took her number, and she left. Immediately, I started packing and looking for other places to move. I found a studio apartment across town, a little more expensive, but that didn't matter. I contacted the person who posted the ad, and they said I could move in as soon as possible. Perfect. Now, I just had to tell Rob and get my money back. I started loading some of my things into my car and texted Rob saying I needed to move back home tomorrow due to family reasons. He didn't respond right away. About an hour later, he came home and asked about my text. I came up with the most convincing story I could, and Rob said he'd give me my money back tomorrow after going to the bank. I felt so relieved. But about an hour later, he knocked on my door and asked, "Did some girl say something to you?" I simply said, "No, what do you mean?" He replied, "Never mind, it just seems like you're running off for another reason." I insisted it was purely for family reasons, and he said okay, then left. Sadly, that wasn't the end of the story. That night, I woke up screaming when I saw a dark figure sitting at the foot of my bed. It was Rob. He turned to me, put his hand over my mouth and whispered, "Shh." I pleaded, "Please don't hurt me." Rob responded, "Why would I hurt you? I know someone said something to you. Don't believe what they say." I told him he was scaring me, and the craziest part, he started caressing my leg and said, "I don't want to scare you." I jumped out of bed and ran for the door. Rob shouted at me to stop, but I ran outside with my phone and called the police. I hid in the bushes until the police arrived. I told them everything that had happened. They made Rob come outside and give his side of the story. I explained to the police that I just wanted to collect my things and leave. The officers stayed while I packed up the rest of my belongings and loaded them into my car. I also insisted that Rob Venmo me the rent money back while the police were there, and he did. The entire time, Rob tried his best to act like a normal person. One of the officers pulled me aside and informed me that Rob had been arrested before for incidents involving women, but Rob denied ever entering my room or touching me, so it was just my word against his. I left the house and went straight to a hotel for the night. The next day, I moved into the studio apartment. Luckily, the girl renting it out facilitated my quick move-in. Since then, I've never and will never live with another man unless he's my boyfriend or husband, or just anyone I don't know well, for that matter. It was my junior year of college when I decided to move off campus into a student apartment building. My roommate was assigned by the school, simply because both of us needed someone to live with. His name was David, and at first, he seemed like a really nice guy. He was friendly, polite, always smiling, and making small talk. But after a few days, I started to notice some strange things about him, little habits and odd behaviors that made me feel uneasy. It began with David frequently hanging around in my room, asking overly personal questions about my life, and rummaging through my belongings as if they were his own. Initially, I thought it was just harmless curiosity, even though it seemed a bit strange. But as time went on, it started to bother me more and more. Then, I began to hear odd noises coming from David's room at night. The whispers and soft shuffling sounds made me anxious. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself that David was probably just watching TV or talking on the phone, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, unable to sleep due to the strange noises coming from David's room, I decided to investigate. I quietly tiptoed down the hallway and pressed my ear against his door, trying to listen to what was going on inside. What I heard was truly weird. It was David whispering to himself, his voice low and raspy. Suddenly, The whispering stopped, leaving only silence. Then, out of nowhere, I heard David say my name, Jeff. How did he know I was standing outside his door? I quickly returned to my room, silently crawling back into bed. I had no idea what to make of it. Why was David talking to himself? Was he hiding something, or was he sleepwalking? But if he was sleepwalking, how did he know I was outside his door? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. As the strange noises from David's room continued each night, my anxiety only grew worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that David was keeping something from me. His behavior also became even more peculiar. I started noticing him giving me odd glances, and his movements seemed increasingly furtive. Another night, I woke up in the middle of the night and heard David whispering again. This time from outside my door, right in the hallway. It genuinely freaked me out, and I began to wonder if he was sleepwalking. I pressed my ear against the door, and just like before, the whispering stopped. Then, once again, David called my name, Jeff. This time, I replied, "Yeah, what's up?" But he didn't respond. I only heard his footsteps retreating to his room. The following night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door closing. I heard David's footsteps walking away down the hallway. This was getting out of hand. The next day, I decided to confront him about his potential sleepwalking. I told David that I had heard him walking around late at night and that he had closed my door the previous night. I then asked him if he had ever been known to sleepwalk or if he had any kind of sleep disorders. At first, he seemed unsure of how to respond, but then he admitted that, yes, he does sometimes tend to sleepwalk. However, I wasn't buying it. Something was definitely wrong. I decided to search David's room for answers. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I waited until David left the apartment, then I sneaked into his room. I didn't have much time, so I quickly tore through his drawers and closets, searching for anything that might explain his strange nighttime behavior. And just when I was about to give up, I found it. A small hidden drawer at the back of David's closet. I opened it, and a cold chill ran down my spine at what I saw inside. It was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, mostly of me sleeping, along with photos of another guy who appeared to be our age. The pictures were taken from various angles and distances, some so close that I could see the pores on my skin and individual strands of hair on my head. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what I was looking at. David had been secretly taking pictures of me while I slept, without my knowledge or consent. I couldn't believe it. I had been living with some kind of sick voyeur. He had been invading my privacy and personal space for who knows how long. I wanted to confront David and demand answers, but I was too afraid of what he might do, afraid of what he might say, and terrified of what might happen if I confronted him alone. So I took pictures of the contents of the drawer and grabbed a handful of the photos as evidence. Then I packed my things. The next day I went to the student housing office and showed them the photos, and they told me to let them handle it. Thankfully, I was assigned to a new apartment with a normal roommate who needed someone to live with. I never spoke to David again. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of those chilling photos and David's whispering and creeping around at night. I never found out who the other guy in the photos was. It was probably David's old roommate, but I was never able to find out his name, and who knows, maybe he discovered the same thing I did. When things got tense with my parents, I had no choice but to move out. The situation was tough. I couldn't keep crashing on my friends' couches forever. I was scrolling through every app and website for apartments and roommates. Eventually, I found a listing that caught my eye on one of the apps. A man named Luke had posted a room for rent in his single-story 3-bedroom house. The rent was $1,200 a month. Basically, he would be both my landlord and roommate since he also lived in the house. Luke made it a point in the ad to emphasize that he would often be out of the house, so the renter would have a lot of time to themselves. However, he also included some strict rules, all in capital letters: no parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and no use of the basement. These rules seemed reasonable enough. I went to check out the house in person and meet Luke. As soon as he opened the door, I got the sense that he was quite reserved. His demeanor was quiet and a bit awkward. Luke gave me a tour of the house, and I could tell he was nervous because his voice shook and he stuttered occasionally. The bedroom was spacious, and the house layout was nice, with an open floor plan that included the kitchen, living room, and dining area. For $1,000 a month in this area, it was a steal. Luke went over a few more rules, especially the ones about not entering the attic or the basement, as he used those spaces for storage. That sounded fair enough. I told him on the spot that I was interested. We shook hands, and 2 days later, I moved in. We didn't sign any lease or rental contract. I would just pay him directly each month. Moving in was quick, as the room was already furnished with a bed and basic furniture. All I did was hang up a few decorations and fill the closet and dresser with clothes. Luckily, the bedroom had a lock, and Luke gave me a key to it so I could lock the door when he wasn't home, which seemed like a nice gesture at the time. Luke never told me what he did for work. He just said that he wouldn't be home often. But I quickly realized that wasn't true. Every time I came home after work, his car was always in the driveway. Soon, I started hearing strange noises outside my bedroom at night. Footsteps, doors opening and closing frequently. One night, I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and noticed the basement door was open. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down, seeing a faint light coming from a distant corner. I could hear banging sounds from down there, and it was 2 a.m. What could he be doing down there at that hour? Then the banging stopped, and Luke appeared at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me. It was so creepy that words can't fully describe it. He looked visibly annoyed. I apologized and told him I was just going to the bathroom. He almost angrily told me to shut the basement door. Feeling weirded out, I did as he said, then went back to bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. About a week later, I came home and found my bedroom door unlocked. I always locked it before leaving, so this was strange. I looked around the room to see if anything was missing, and although nothing seemed to be gone, I noticed that some things had been moved. My clothes in the dresser were no longer neatly stacked. They had clearly been gone through. The closet door was also slightly ajar. It dawned on me that Luke probably had his own key and had come into my room to rummage through my stuff. This felt like a clear invasion of privacy, and I knew I had to confront him about it. I went to knock on Luke's bedroom door, but he didn't answer, even though his car was in the driveway. The uneasy feeling was growing, so I gave up and went back to my room. After microwaving my dinner and watching TV, I heard Luke's door open. I took the opportunity to confront him as he was about to leave the house. I asked him outright if he had gone into my room, but he looked at me with a blank expression and said no. I calmly responded, saying that the door was unlocked, and some of my things appeared to have been gone through. He insisted that I had the only key to my room, then said he was in a hurry and left. I was completely thrown by this, feeling more uneasy than ever. I wanted to ask my parents for advice, but I was mad at them at the time and didn't want to reach out. I started looking up new listings on apps and websites again, knowing I didn't want to stay there. Then I realized this was the first time Luke hadn't been home while I was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check out the basement. I checked out the window first to make sure Luke's car was gone, and it was. I opened the basement door but couldn't find any light switches, so I used the flashlight on my phone to navigate. The stairs creaked as if I were in an abandoned house. When I got to the bottom, I saw a brown carpet that was curling up at the edges, like it had been poorly fitted to the floor. The basement was smaller than I expected, with just one old couch in the middle of the room. The smell down there was awful, and it got worse as I got closer to a door in the corner. I tried to open it, but it was locked, which, in hindsight, might have been a blessing because I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was behind that door. The smell was like raw sewage, but worse. I did a quick sweep of the basement but didn't find much, just a few taped-up cardboard boxes, which I wasn't about to open. I went back upstairs and shut the door.